We should have turned back at the forest, but the bells, they were still ringing.
Welcome back to Heartwood Abyss. In today's build, I'll be creating the final chapter of this dark fantasy journey. A corrupted chapel standing before the monastery itself. I started by cutting out some pieces of foam using my hot wire station. These will form the foundation of the chapel. Once the base was glued in place, I moved on to the stonework. To create the bricks, I cut larger blocks from XPS foam and tossed them into a metal tin together with some small stones. After sealing the container, I shook it vigorously, letting the rough surfaces carve into the natural worn texture. With the bricks ready, I began placing them around the foundation of the chapel, slowly building up the structure and extending the stonework along the sides of the base. Then it was time to start working on the walls of the chapel. I found some great looking church windows online and 3D printed them. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to check them out. To fit them into the build, I carefully cut out sections of the wall in the exact shape of the windows, so they could sit neatly inside. With that done, I glued a foam board sheet onto the diorama to form the main wall structure and moved on to the brickwork, using smaller bricks made with the same technique as before. I started placing them one by one along the walls. This was a slow process, and yeah, it took a lot of time across the entire diorama, but in the end, it really pays off in the level of detail. After finishing the first two walls, I cut out a section so you can look inside the chapel. I originally planned to make it removable, but it made viewing awkward, so I scrapped that idea and kept it open instead. Then it was time to build out the rest of the structure. I started by gluing a large foam board piece to the back, shaping it to fit, and adding a small tower to make the chapel more interesting. Once the structure was in place, I went back to placing bricks, one by one. This alone took me about 3 days. With the brickwork finally done, it was time to add the floor. I cut small tiles of XPS foam, textured them using a rock, and placed them one by one. Next up, the door. I used the foam piece I cut out of the wall as a template and traced its shape onto balsa wood. After cutting the pieces out, I glued the wood onto the foam to create a thick chapel doors. To add texture, I pressed in vertical lines to form the wooden planks, then glued the finished door into the diorama. Next, I moved on to building the roof of the chapel. I started by using some thick scrap balsa wood to create the main beam, which would support the entire structure. Once that was in place, I added smaller balsa wood beams along the sides to act as supports, carefully spacing them out to shape the roof. After making sure everything was aligned properly, I glued all the beams into place. Next, I added the roof panels. I used sheets of balsa wood and drew in planked lines to give them a wooden texture. Originally it was meant to add extra strength to the structure back when I still planned for the removable wall. Once the panels were in place, I moved on to sealing the entire build. I covered everything in a base coat made from plaster, black paint and PVA glue, giving the foam a much stronger outer layer. Next I worked onto the terrain, using some homemade sculptor mold. I built up the ground around the chapel and in the garden, adding some natural height variation. Next I worked on the arches along the right side of the chapel, the kind of walkway you often see in monasteries. I started by sketching out the arch shapes onto some XPS foam, then carefully cut each one out. To support the structure, I used small balsa wood sticks as pillars, cutting and shaping them to fit neatly underneath the arches. Once everything was in place, I added the brick texture by drawing it directly onto the foam, giving the stonework more depth and detail. Finally, I glued the beams onto the arches and attached the entire wall section to the diorama. Next I moved back to the terrain and mixed together PVA glue, black paint, plaster and fine sand into a thick paste, then spread it over the sculptor mold to add more texture. While it was still wet, I pressed in some gravestones made from scrap XPS foam and small wooden sticks. Next I finished the roof using smaller balsa wood planks with varying thickness for a more worn look, placing them one by one. Then I built the tower roof, shaping it from XPS foam and covering it with small wooden shingles. Next I started applying the first base coats. I used the airbrush to cover the roof in the burnt umber tone, then gave the brickwork a deep blue-grey coat and painted the ground in a muddy brown. After the base coats were done, I moved on to a small birch tree I sculpted and printed myself. These will be available on my mini factory soon. I started with a white base coat, then added the dark bark texture using a brush. Next I moved on to the foliage. I started with one of my sculpted and 3D printed pine trees, applying glue to the branches and sprinkling on some dark green flocking. To add more depth, I followed it with a layer of fine turf. With that done, I moved on to the birch tree. I mixed up a flocking paste using PVA glue and 2 tones of autumn foliage. Then pressed it onto the branches in small clumps. Next I worked onto the terrain. I started by gluing the birch tree into place using superglue. Then I added small fallen leaves across the garden using autumn leaf flocking, followed by some fine grass for extra detail. For the walls I wanted to add some ivy, so I used fake sheep moss and fixed it in place with watered down PVA glue. Next I added a roof to the walkway. I built some structural supports from balsa wood beams and glued them onto the arches. Once those were in place, I added wooden planks across the top, just like a chapel roof, and finished it off with wooden shingles. For the final steps, I unified the diorama with a coat of deep blue-grey. Then I glued the pine tree and the models into place. And with that, it was time to move on to the story, while continuing the painting.
The chapel stood just before the monastery gates, intact and untouched, as if nothing had ever reached it. We should have understood what that meant. The doors were already open. Inside the air was heavy, not with decay, but with heat. Something alive was breathing in that room. We stepped in slowly, weapons drawn, eyes searching. That's when we saw it. In the back of the chapel, it waited. A winged creature, tall and still. Its form stretched, its body pulsing faintly in the dim light. Not hidden, not afraid, watching. Around it, only a few eggs remained, clustered close, protected. Not abandoned, not scattered, guarded. We thought it was the source. We were wrong. The floor shifted and something stepped between us. The guardian, larger, closer, built for one purpose, not to hunt, but to stop anything that came too near. It didn't look back, it didn't need to. The creature behind it didn't move, didn't react, because it already knew how this would end. We tried to advance. The first strike never landed. The guardian moved faster than anything that size should. Steel shattered, bone followed. We fell back, too late. The doors behind us were already closing, sealing, trapping. We weren't intruders. We were a test, and we failed it. One by one, we were cut down, not by the thing we feared, but by what was placed there, to ensure nothing ever reached it. As the last of us fell, we saw it clearly. The creature in the back did not flee, did not attack. It simply watched, waiting, growing. And something beyond this chapel, past the monastery walls, something greater was still untouched. And we never made it past the threshold.